Hi, my name is Jonathan Wiley. I'm a digital learning consultant at Grantwood AEA, and I'm here with my friend Lynn for our presentation today.
Yay, we're so excited to have you with us. As Jonathan just said, my name is Lynn Kleinmeyer. I'm also a digital learning consultant for Grantwood AEA. And before we start our session, leveraging digital tools for student success, a couple caveats. Jonathan and I fully recognize that this is a 30-minute session. And so knowing that constraint, that we are not going to be able to get into the depth of the conversation that we would really love to. Instead, this session is really meant to be an introduction to some of the concepts and shifting some thinking about how you can leverage your digital tools to address your students' needs. And so we really do encourage you to join us for our Q&A session, which is going to be on Monday, April 12th at noon. Should we get started, Jonathan?
Let's do it. So as we begin our conversation here, we would like you to just maybe reflect a little bit on the experiences from last year. Obviously, we went through a lot of changes and a lot of challenges. And as you go through and think about some of the things we're talking about today, I think you're going to find a lot of relevance. You're going to find a lot of connections. So we're not really trying to show you anything that's brand new and completely different. It's going to turn your life upside down like the pandemic did. This is going to be something that's going to fit in fine with all the things you're already doing. So look for those connections. We're going to try and make some for you, but if we don't make all of them, I'm sure you're going to help us out for this one.
If this last year taught us anything, it's really that this has been an opportune time for us to really examine our instructional practices and to really reconsider what's working and for whom, and to design learning opportunities from a place of empathy so that we really truly are honoring and recognizing all of our learners.
So how do we get there? Well, one way might be to take a look at the UDL guidelines from CAST. This is the framework that we're going to use as an underlying platform for what we're talking about today. It's a collection of research-based strategies that are designed to make your students expert learners. And so you can see here, they're divided into three columns. We've got the why of learning, the what of learning, and the how of learning. And we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to just look at what those are, what those mean, and how we can maybe use some technology to help enhance and make those things work better.
Before we move into our exploration of each of these different components, the one piece I want to point out and highlight here is that these UDL guidelines, they actually are interactive. So when you navigate your way to the guidelines themselves, you're able to click on all of these different components and it will actually expand, give you a little more context, give you some ideas beyond what Jonathan and I are going to be sharing with you today. The other thing I want to highlight and point out here as well is that all of these are not meant to be a checklist. It's instead about a mindset shift. It's things that you are considering when crafting and creating instructional experiences for your students. And so they're just things to be mindful of. It's not that piece of the checklist of checking a box and, yep, I've done all of these things. It's about knowing your students and being very, very intentional from the get-go. So with that, let's jump into that exploration of engagement. So we're going to start with exploring that engagement component and the why of learning. Now, a quick little caveat again, really making sure that we have that common language and common understanding. So one of the things that we really want to highlight here is this idea that engagement is not the same as compliance. Engagement in our context is really truly how do you invite your students to be active participants in the learning process. So we have linked into not only the slide deck, but also into our resources, this great article by Peter DeWitt that's really talking about which kinds of tasks and which invitations are you extending to your students. So like I said, as we are continuing our conversation, please remember that it's through that lens of the invitation to be active participants.
So here's the first one we're going to talk about here, the idea of providing multiple means of engagement. So we're not just looking at how to engage students, we're looking at multiple ways to engage students. And that's something I think is something that's worth emphasizing there. So you can see this talks about recruiting interest here. So it could be giving students choice, minimizing threats and distractions in the classroom. That's all about keeping your students engaged and interested. But there's also other components here, like sustaining effort and persistence, and also that self-regulation part, which obviously looks different at different grade levels. But let's dive in a little bit deeper and see if we can maybe show you some quick wins for how to get your students engaged in the classroom.
So as we think of quick wins, what are some small actionable things that we could do to really have a big impact? And once again, this is about being intentional. So when you think about offering your students that invitation into the learning process, it could be as simple as creating choice boards for your students, for example, where you're giving them opportunities to pick and choose between different learning activities or different materials that are all equal, but are in different modalities so that your students can access them and find those things that might be relevant. Also, little things like knowing those students so that you can craft those choice boards intentionally. So knowing your kiddos and how they prefer to learn, how they prefer to engage with content. And so those are just a couple quick strategies. Jonathan, anything else stand out to you?
No, I like that one about the, almost like creating learner profiles and having that background knowledge of what your students like and are interested in. I think that's a great way just to make that learning come to life. I like that one the best.
Yeah. Now, we are digital learning consultants. We obviously believe strongly that technology can actually provide some of these opportunities for our students. Once again, we want you to be intentional, but for the purposes of our presentation today, what we have done is picked a couple resources that we feel like could be leveraged and in an intentional way to make a connection to that engagement piece. So these hopefully look somewhat familiar, but Jonathan, as you look at this list, for you, what stands out and how would you use it in your context?
Well, you mentioned choice boards and playlists, and I think Google Docs are a really simple and straightforward way of starting those types of things. I know a lot of people are using things like HyperDocs to do things like this, where all the learning is given to the students at one time, and then they get to work through it at their own pace. And there's going to be some choices in there along the way. So Google Docs, I mean, if you can create a Google Doc and you can create links to learning, then yeah, you can give students choice. You can make those playlists and choice boards and keep your students engaged in the learning.
Yeah. And for me, both Pear Deck and Jamboard are deeply linked to engagement. So I'll start with Pear Deck. With Pear Deck, it's that idea of doing some of those social emotional check-ins with your kiddos, just to kind of get that sense of where they're at for learning that particular day. So there's those social emotional beginning of the lesson kinds of slides that you can insert, or there's also the feedback and the mood piece of when your students enter into a Pear Deck engagement, they actually get to say how they're feeling for the day. All of those are little quick wins that could be really impactful information for you to know as an instructor. And I also think about one of the components of this engagement piece is that really building community. So I think about Jamboard. And when you utilize Jamboard, because it's that interactive whiteboard that can be used whether you're face-to-face or whether you're in a virtual environment, but really truly it offers that moment for kids to come together and have that exchange of ideas that is absolutely essential for the learning process. So each of these kind of highlights and directly links back to those engagement components.
And these are all free options. These are all available to every educator in Iowa. So if you haven't tried one of these tools and you want to talk more about them, come to our Q&A session and we're happy to jump in and do a demo and show you how some of these things work too.
Yeah. So we fully recognize that this is not an end-all be-all list. So we invite you to pause this recording for just a moment and have a moment of personal reflection for yourself, thinking about what tools do you use to engage your students and how are you using them in that intentional way that directly relates back to one of the components that we highlighted from the UDL guidelines.
All right, so that takes us on to thinking about representation, which is the what of learning, what students are actually learning about. So let's take a look into that and see what that looks like. Here you can see we're thinking about the three broad headings of perception, language and symbols, and comprehension. So we're looking at ways here to see how we can, break down a few barriers for students in terms of how they are accessing some of that learning there. So this is about making it as accessible as possible for students so that they can get into that learning and engage with that learning and not have any misconceptions or barriers to prevent that.
Yeah. So to me, this whole category is really about honoring the student's learning experience and allowing them to own the learning experience and to customize it so that it's meeting their needs and their preferences. So a couple quick win ideas, simple actionable things that you can leverage. For me, one of the pieces that I think about is that, once again, that customizing the learning experience and allowing kids to own theirs is really that second bullet of allowing students to customize their display. So whether it's allowing them to customize the display on their specific device or looking at, there's a lot of really great resources that have the ability to change texts, change the font sizes and things like that, really honoring students and helping them kind of figure out what works for them as learners. Jonathan, how about you? What sticks out?
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to when I taught in the classroom, the easiest thing in the world is just to give everybody the same thing. Everybody's on the same textbook, everybody's on the same worksheet or whatever. But I think, and I absolutely did that, but I think that today with the technology and the resources available to us, it's just really doesn't take a whole lot of thought or a whole lot of extra thinking to think about ways how we can reinvent and change some of those texts and things. So for instance, like the text-to-speech tools available, a lot of the tools that we use today come built in with text-to-speech tools already in them as part of the service that they offer. And if they don't have it inside of the actual tool that you're using, the devices we're using as well make that a very approachable thing. So if you're not assessing the student's spelling, give them some time to play with those text-to-speech tools if they think that's going to speed up their process and help them get into that content better.
Yeah, I mean, it's about proactively removing some barriers for your students as well along the process. So speaking of removing barriers, thinking about what are some resources at your fingertips that not only remove barriers for those who might be needing that extra scaffolding, but also allows students to customize that learning experience.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's tools that are going to be available for everybody to use. So I mentioned, just briefly a minute ago about things that are already built into the devices that you're using, whether it's Chromebooks or iPads or Macs or Windows PCs. One of the great things about the devices that we have today is that all these companies are really pushing the accessibility options. And, it could be something as simple as turning on closed captions. If you have, English language learners in your classroom or you want to see closed captions in a Google Slides presentation or in a YouTube video or in a Google Meet call, that is available to you in so many places now, as is text to speech and speech to text and zooming in and out of your screen, or even just simple things like dark mode and things like that. These are just all extra preferences. And at one point we might have said, stop messing around with your computer, stop changing all the settings and everything else. But, now it's a chance for students to customize the learning to be the way that they prefer it to be.
Right. And it's not just about, scaffolding those who need it. It's also about taking that step back and allowing and empowering your students. Because I love what you talked about with the closed captioning. For example, there might be times where I'm in a really noisy room and I just would prefer to be able to read along so that I'm gaining the information. And so that's what these are all about. And so that idea of, once again, opening up for not only scaffolding students, but also for customizing things for preference. Immersive reader is something that we're seeing incorporated into more and more tools. So I'm going to circle back to Pear Deck, which we already mentioned. There's actually a beta version of immersive reader. And so what immersive reader does is takes text and kind of simplifies it in a way where it removes distractions. So we're thinking back to that engagement piece, but also allows for some of those customization and scaffolding things. So it will read text aloud to students. The students can customize the background for that particular information. I think about how much time we spend on the internet, and I, for myself, need to customize the background so that it's not so glaring on my eyes, just kind of thinking about the exhaustion piece. So it allows for background changes. It allows the text to be read aloud for students. So there's a lot. It's a very robust tool that does a lot to empower your students. There's also tools that already have this built in. So I'm going to go to the AEA online resources. And as a former teacher librarian, I loved Britannica Online because a lot of these pieces were actually built into the tool already. So with Britannica Online, students can adjust the reading level of the text to kind of help them figure out where their entry point is. They can have the text read aloud to them. It will translate it for them. There's some customization pieces with, once again, the formatting of how it looks for them. There's a lot of resources already built into some of your AEA online resources that I would encourage you to explore.
Yeah, and going forward, I think that's definitely a big part of when we are renewing contracts and looking for new tools with vendors, then we want to see those accessibility features built in there. So you can expect to see that in lots of those AEA online resources.
Yeah. So once again, Jonathan and I fully recognize this is not an end-all be-all list. So we invite you once again to pause the recording and just have a moment of self-reflection. What are the ways that you're offering your students the multiple access points to the content, interaction points to the content? And with those tools that you already maybe have access to, how are you using them to address that representation idea that we just discussed? All right, to the last category, action and expression. This is really how your students are demonstrating their learning and how they're managing the learning process for themselves.
All right, so as you can see here, we got 3 categories again that appear in those UDL guidelines for you here. So providing options for physical action, for expression and communication, and then there's that executive functioning part that's in here too. So quite a lot of this part here might be in terms of how students can show what they know. This is how they're demonstrating their learning here, but that executive functioning part is something that we should definitely not forget about, and it's definitely something that is very relevant to all age groups of kids as they go through school, that they need those self-management skills, those productivity skills, those organizational skills to help them stay on task at school.
Yeah. So as we look at quick wins for this particular category, once again, you'll see that choice boards show up here too, because choice boards is something that can be leveraged throughout the entire experience. In this case, the choice board really is about choosing how students actually show their learning and finding ways that maybe are meaningful to the student, as opposed to that everyone must do this exact same thing, writing the exact same essay. Now, don't get me wrong. If the standard that you're trying to address is actual composition of an essay, maybe that makes sense. But if not, thinking about for those students who maybe the act of writing, that composition is a barrier, that idea of shifting it to a modality that makes more sense for them. So for example, allowing some video reflections or audio reflections, are there other ways that you can really get insight into what your students know and are able to do? What else stands out, Jonathan?
Yeah, and we got the rubrics and checklists on here too. I think this definitely is something that everybody can benefit from, whether you are assigning something to a student, just so that they know, what is required for me to be successful. And, sometimes we only give out rubrics or checklists on like final assessments and things like that. But, it doesn't have to be a formal thing necessarily. It could be just something you have written up on the board. It's like, so in order to do this task successfully, you have to do A, B, and C. And, if you're doing choices for things, if you're letting students choose, like Lynn was talking about, whether they produce that in video or audio or in text, then you can still have some universal checklists or universal things that you want to see from students. You want to see good grammar, you want to see evidence of planning, you want to see that they are meeting the objective of what it is you're assessing. You can definitely make universal rubrics and checklists that incorporate choice as well there too.
Yeah. And I love that idea of using the rubrics and the checklists at the beginning of the learning process, like letting kids see those so that as they're going through, they're actually also learning some of those, the project management skills that we know are so essential. And then also the other piece that I found, and I was so guilty of this as a classroom teacher, is providing that space for them to reflect, not only on what they're learning, but also on their process of learning as well. So just like before, we have a couple ideas for you that hopefully, once again, look super familiar, but showcase different ways that you can really support that action and expression component of the UDL framework. So Jonathan, which one do you want to start with?
I'm going to start with Flipgrid because I think that's one of my favorite ones on here. I like it now that they have really broadened the components that they have in here in terms of student responses. It started off as a video reflection tool, which was great. You could put a prompt in there for students, either a video prompt or a text prompt, and they would record their replies as a video. However, they've really expanded what that looks like now. And you don't just have to do video. They can respond with audio. They can respond with text comments. They could even respond with a screencast now. So there's lots of different ways that students could show what they know. And if they feel a little self-conscious talking to the webcam, like Lynn and I are doing right now, then they can turn off the webcam and just do audio, or they can do text. And it's just a really great tool for offering some of those choices to show what you know.
Yeah. And kind of piggybacking off of that, this seesaw, I think we definitely have seen an increase of schools that are continuing to utilize and leverage seesaw for their students. When you think about that activity component where you're really asking students to interact with content, one of the beautiful things is there's actually already robust tools built into seesaw as well. So that idea that students can capture their thinking by creating a self-reflected video or picture that they can annotate, then they can add in their own voiceovers. So once again, it gives additional insight, but it's all packaged in a way that really makes this robust, insightful opportunity for your students to showcase what they know, and added bonus to be able to share with their families. The other one that we would be remiss, I am a Google Keep fan. And so when we think about that executive functioning piece too, one of the things we wanted to just revisit is that idea of helping kids manage and collect their resources while they're going through projects, and kind of that whole project management component. Google Keep for the win, because you can pull it in, resources into notes and keep them organized using the different various labels or tags. But also, I love it because I am a checklist kind of person. I want to make sure that I'm, dotting my I's, crossing my T's, all of that good stuff. And so you can use, of course, the checklist component within your notes in Google Keep, just to kind of, once again, make sure that you're doing things, and it helps kids chunk things and break down tasks. And the added bonus is they can have collaborators so that you can get the insight and kind of see where they are within the process as well.
Yeah, nice features as well, like the ability to do audio recordings or to take pictures of things instead of necessarily just taking notes with everything. So really great multimedia tool.
Yeah. So as we've done before, we're going to invite you to pause the recording for just a moment and once again, do a little self-reflection. So what tools are you using and leveraging to allow your students voice and choice in how they're showcasing their learning? And in what ways are they addressing the components of that UDL guideline? So as we said at the very beginning of our session together today, we recognize that this was 30 minutes. It was a very kind of overview, bird's eye view of all of this conversation. And there is definitely opportunity to continue to dig deeper. But if nothing else, one of the things that we want you to take away from the conversation today is this idea that we know that we are not going to prevent all of the challenges that our students can face, but by being intentional and leveraging some of those think abouts from the UDL guidelines, what we hope is that you'll find opportunities where you can increase your intentionality, maybe build upon some of those things that you're already doing that are great for your students, but really think about designing with empathy so that we truly are leveraging our digital tools for student success.